Hi everyone, welcome back to another amazing episode of the Eternum Labs podcast. Today we have on our show Dr. Mike T. Nelson. He is an extreme human performance specialist, a fitness and nutrition educator, and he is a researcher and speaker. It is our mission to bring to you the leading people in the game to help you optimize your health, live in your best energy, perform at your peak, and live the best life that you can for as long as you can. So without any further ado, guys, I hope you enjoy this podcast as much as we did. And again, if you would like any of our supplements or would like to see any of our range, head to eternumlabs.com.au. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next one. Thank you so much, Dr. Mike, for coming onto the show. How are you?
I'm doing good. Thank you so much for having me here. I really appreciate it.
That's okay. I just like to know and start talking about just quickly, because obviously you research and you study and you coach people all the time. What is on your mind at the moment? What have you been researching into? What have you been learning, figuring out? I'd love to dive into that.
Yeah, I had a bunch of stuff. So I recently went to the International Society of Sports Nutrition Conference about 6 weeks ago now in Florida. And that was great. Helped some undergrads. I was just more consulting on the paper they did looking at caffeine intake, more coffee, and heart rate variability. So they presented a poster there, and one of them did a session. So with my buddy, Dr. Lonnie Lowry. So it was cool to see undergrad students. He was advising them, getting involved in research. So that was awesome. Got to see everyone again, some latest research in general. And then probably like a bigger topic I've looked at a fair amount recently in the past couple of years is on physiologic flexibility. So I've done stuff on metabolic flexibility. How well can you use fats? How well can you use carbohydrates? How well can you switch back and forth? And then for people probably similar in your audience, I'm always thinking like, what is kind of like the next level, right? So let's say you're pretty good at nutrition, your training's pretty good, like you get some sleep and nutrition's dialed in pretty good. Like, how do you figure out like what is the next level of things? So I always try to think in terms of framework. So with physiologic flexibility, it's what are the regulators your body has to hold constant, and then can you train around them, which are called homeostatic regulators. So the big one that's kind of even popular now is temperature, right? So humans have to hold about 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. If you're in the US, I know you guys use centigrade over there,
7.5.
but it has to be, has to be constant. But you could do cold water exposure, you could do sauna, do steam room, you could do other things to train that sort of human dynamic range of your body within those systems. So I've been looking at that probably for like the last 10 years and ended up developing a course on it. So it covers everything from breath work to temperature, cold water exposures, sauna, high intensity interval training, which will try to potentially alter pH, ketones, glucose, and then how you regulate oxygen and CO2.
So through physical like training, you're measuring these different things. Like, how do you do that?
Yeah, that was the trick, right? Because if your temperature, say, for example, gets a little bit too high or too low, you're screwed because you're dead, right? So you can't necessarily measure temperature as a proxy. Plus, you'd have to do a core body temperature, and no one likes anal probes and stuff like that in order to measure it. So you're left with, okay, that's not really going to work. And it's not sensitive enough, because by the time you start seeing those things drift, you're really probably becoming unsafe, unless you've got really, dead nuts on, lab equipment, which people don't have. But you can measure your exposure to it and treat it as a stressor, just like exercise. So let's say you're a crazy person like me and you convert a chest freezer into cold water immersion and stick it in your garage, which I did. Yeah, awesome.
Great.
And with that, you can then control the temperature of the water, and then you control how long you're in there. So you can think of the temperature almost like the weight that you're lifting. It's sort of like an intensity marker. And then how long you're in is like the volume of load that you're doing. And by looking at those and just starting very conservatively, you can just do progressive overload just like you would with training. So I usually recommend people, if they don't have any exposure, start out at around, 50 degrees Fahrenheit, which is that 20 degrees centigrade? Don't ask me, my conversions are really horrible. But it's cold, but it's not super cold, right? So Then you can add, let's say, just get in 30 seconds and then get back out. And then once you can work your way slowly up to, I usually go around 5 to 6 minutes, then I would drop the temperature by a couple degrees. And then I would start off at a very low time, maybe 30, 60 seconds, and then build back up again, right? It'd just be like if you're doing a bench press, you're going to lift a heavier load, and then you're going to try to do it for some volume, keep adding volume, keep adding volume, keep adding volume. And then you're going to come back and add a little more weight to the bar, and you're going to just keep adding more volume again. So it's the same idea. And as long as the RPE or just how it feels kind of stays similar, then you know your body is adapting to it. So you don't have to get super fancy. You can do measurements like that. You could do the same thing with a sauna. You could use temperature and then duration of how long you're in. And those become your markers to try to measure your adaptation to it.
And why would we want to try and measure our adaptation to this? Like, as well, just quickly, 50 degrees Fahrenheit is 10 degrees Celsius.
Oh, 10 degrees. Oh, shit,
yeah,
that was off.
So that's nice and cold. No, that's all right. And then I think it was like it was 37 degrees Fahrenheit or something. It's like 0 degrees Celsius.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I stick to the 0 degrees.
Yeah.
We just don't care anymore. So I
knew that one.
Yeah. But yeah, so why would we want to get good adaptation to these?
It's a good question. If you look at the research is really split. But if you look at heat, for example, there's more data on heat than there is cold. You can look at some of the Finnish sauna studies, which have very impressive mortality. Granted, it's conducted in Finland, and if you've ever been there, it's really just part of the culture. It's very much a social thing a lot of times too. Like the Finnish people, if you didn't have a sauna in your house, you're a weirdo. Like everybody has at least one sauna in their house, sometimes two. If you go to their cabin, everyone has a sauna at the cabin. They may have one inside. They may have one outside by the lake. So it's a little harder to tease out because it's kind of part of the culture. But we do see like massive increases in just how long people live. If we look at mechanisms with heat, you just see this cold too, changes in these little proteins called heat shock proteins. And these seem to confer just better adaptation to different stressors. There's some interesting literature showing that in untrained people, having them be exposed to sauna, I believe it was 3 or 4 days a week, got similar responses as a moderate cardiovascular training program. Now, granted, these were, untrained people, so they haven't really been training much. But the adaptations you can get with heat sometimes mimic cardiovascular exercise. And if you've ever been in a sauna, it gets hot, you have an elevated heart rate, different markers go up. What's interesting too is that if you train and you do cardiovascular training, the mechanisms of the benefit from cardiovascular training and sauna are a little bit different. So I think there's some overlap with it. If we go all the way back to why would you do these things at like a very high level? I think by looking at things called homeostatic regulators that we talked about, things that your body absolutely has to hold constant in order for you to survive. If we go one level up, my bias is that your body is just designed for survival. Everything physiologically is wired in order to survive. So if you want longevity, better health, better quality of life, then through that lens, you would want to do things that are increasing your body's chance to survive. And by training those homeostatic regulators, you can expand the range that they can then operate in. And I think that we'll see benefits, I would say maybe not similar to exercise, but definitely benefits in terms of quality of life. There's other very specific things. Cold water immersion has very interesting metabolic properties of disposing of glucose. We're not really sure exactly how that happens, but I did this, and you've probably done it too. Take your blood glucose beforehand. Again, these are US units. Mine was like 85, and then I got in there. It was 45 degrees for about 4 or 5 minutes. Nothing too crazy. So probably 8 degrees centigrade. And I measured it right as I got out, and my blood glucose dropped down into like 56.
What?
And the weird part was I didn't feel hypoglycemic. I didn't feel weird or anything like that. Granted, that's an acute effect, but there's some research showing that metabolic effects from cold and even from heat are pretty interesting, and they may be operating over different mechanisms than even exercise, which means by having exposure to different temperatures for someone who's like this audience, their nutrition's pretty good and they're already exercising, it may confer benefits even above and beyond what exercise is already providing too.
That is wild. No, I haven't not tested my blood glucose before and
Yeah,
after.
you should test it. I'd be super interested in what you find.
I'm definitely going to do that for sure. It's weird because sometimes I do, when I do get out the ice bath, like for that period of time, like the 10 to 15 minutes, it is a little bit like, I feel a little bit sometimes like, whoa,
Oh yeah.
this is going. And every time, like after an ice bath, I'm usually a little bit lighter in terms of my weight for the next 2 days, which is really interesting. And actually have a question for you in regards, because I was actually, when I was on a quick jog this morning, I was thinking about this. I was like, what is happening here? This is in terms of metabolic flexibility, because I get into an ice bath every Friday. I get into a sauna a couple of times a week, an infrared sauna. And I've been eating a predominantly higher carb diet with lower fats. Body weight's like been dropping, and I was like, all right, well, I'm going to remove some of these carbs so I can, because at the moment I've got a fitness show coming up, just trying to get as lean as possible. So I was like, yep, slowly dropping calories, and then I was like, all right, I'm going to switch over, drop the amount of carbs, increase the fats a little bit, see what happens, and my weight's gone up. Like, what is going on here? Yeah, weight is going up. So it was like really interesting. It's only just started though, so the week. So I'm like, I don't know, because I haven't been testing blood glucose. I don't know if like my insulin spiking or anything like that's happening at the moment. But it was just like really interesting. I'm like,
Have you, when you did that, did you put less salt on your food?
No, I'd say about the same amount of salt.
Same.
I put a
Okay.
lot of salt. I put a lot of salt.
Interesting.
Yeah, might just be.
Yeah, I don't know.
Don't know.
I mean, the only thing I can think of, which again is just a shot in the dark and pretty hypothetical, is sometimes when people drop their carbs pretty drastically, and granted, it makes complete sense of why you're doing it because of a physique show, and their training stays relatively high. Sometimes that can be a stressor, and their body may retain more fluid because of it, which is kind of a weird paradox because, as you know, most of the time when you drop carbohydrates, you start using more muscle glycogen, which may or may not be replaced depending upon what your diet is at and when you measure it. So most people will see a drop in weight because of that. So that would be my guess. I don't know if you had a resting heart rate or HRV. You could look at those scores and see if they changed at all.
Yeah, I do. So I have an Oura ring and I wear that and I track that the whole time.
Okay.
And HRV is nice and high. So I'm like, well, should be burning fat. Body temperature's the same. I got like the wake up this morning, go out and crush today. I've trained 5 days in a row. I'm not going out and crushing today. I'm going to do lots of aerobic training. Like, I'm not going to be doing any hardcore training. So, yeah, just some stuff to look into. I'd also like for you, just for anyone who's listening and they're not unsure, like exactly what we're talking about in terms of metabolic flexibility, to touch on it beforehand, is in like your body's ability to digest carbohydrates and your body's ability to digest fats. And in terms of being able to optimize that, what would you say?
The plan that I generally use is it's variable depending upon the person, but similar to what you have. For people who exercise a lot, let's say you're weight training Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, doing some aerobic stuff, Tuesday, Thursday, maybe Sunday, doing a few runs in the morning, that type of thing. And they're a little bit more on the intermediate to advanced side. I tend to have higher carbohydrates on the weight training days, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, and then a little bit lower carbohydrates on the other days. That also gives you potentially a way of adjusting calories too. So if someone is trying to cut down a little bit, you'll have a bigger differential between those 2 days. That way you're still providing carbohydrates for exercise, especially lifting weights. And you have a little bit lower carbohydrate days when you're doing more easier, moderate aerobic training. And so on those days, you're trying to switch a little bit. Lifting days primarily use a little bit more carbohydrates. Other days use a little bit more fat. And it's also an easy way to get more of a caloric deficit without harming your lifting performance. Because the tricky thing is you still want to keep a highest level of performance you can, because that's burning calories. That's a stimulus for holding on to as much muscle as you can. But you have to also be in a caloric deficit overall over the course of a week, month in order to lose weight. So if people are doing it for body comp, that's kind of where I start. The differential really depends on the person and their performance. So we'll try to slowly cut down and really keep an eye on their performance in the gym. look at their heart rate variability and make sure they're not getting too stressed. In a lot of cases, I'll use a longer fast on one of those days too. Like Tuesday, Thursday may work up to like a 19 or 24-hour fast where they wouldn't be consuming anything other than just fluid and electrolytes. If people haven't done that before, the kind of run-in period to that is going to be like 4 to 6 weeks, just taking that day and progressively doing a little bit longer fast. But I found that that works pretty good. For some people, that's paradoxically easier than low carbohydrate or low calorie days. I don't know if that is a mental thing or there's something more physiologically going on. Most of the research we have now says there's not huge difference physiologically. Again, depends on what animal model you use or if you look at humans. But I've just noticed over the last 10 years that doing a period of fasting once they're acclimated to it is actually easier than trying to go really low calories on that one particular day.
I could not agree, and I love so much that you've said that because intuitively I do one 24-hour fast a week.
Nice.
And try and try to do that, and then I'll like, because obviously from my perception, I'm like, well, my human growth hormone's going to go up, my stomach's going to get a rest from digesting all of this protein, and during this fast, my mind is like super optimized, and I don't have to worry about eating. I have all the rest of this time during the day to just get out there and get a whole bunch of things done. And yeah, real good for the digestive system as well. Like I find personally, like next day, best poos ever. But yeah, but yeah, I'd also love to talk to you about stress and HRV as you're mentioning, because I get like a few people ask me questions on that as well, and like you're the master, so I'd love to hear what you say about it.
Yeah, so HRV is a way that you can measure stress on the autonomic system. So I started looking at HRV as part of my PhD research, almost 14 years ago now. And at that time, we didn't have any of these. I sound like some old codger now, but we didn't have like these fancy little apps on the phone. So we had like used equipment that cost us like 10 grand to kind of assemble together. People had to come in the lab in order to get the measurement, and I had to write this little MATLAB code to transfer it. And it was just kind of a pain in the ass in order to do. But luckily, a few years after that, after we did the main study for data collection, we did 2 studies. Then the first app I used was iFleet. And I talked to Simon, who's running the company, who's still the CEO. He's like, yeah, I got this app that can measure HRV on your phone. I was like, what? Like, there's like no way this thing is accurate, And turns out it's pretty accurate. They've got some published research on it. So within a short period of time with technology, used equipment that cost us 10 grand, that was a pain in the ass, and you had to submit it to other programs. You could do at that time was like $10 an app on your phone. I was like, wow, this is crazy. Like, at the time I'm like, everyone's going to be doing this. It's going to be like the next greatest thing. And so I started doing it with all my clients. This is 8 years ago now, maybe. And like, no one really cared. It wasn't really a thing. And I think it was because people don't understand things that involve math. And now it's to the point where people just know what HRV kind of is, and the math is sort of hidden in the background. And now it's almost the opposite. Like every company is trying to shove it into every device known to man, which has its own other issues too. So HRV is really nice because at the end of the day, the only thing it's measuring is the status on your autonomic nervous system, right? So for your listeners who already know, autonomic nervous system has 2 branches. One is the parasympathetic side, which is like the brake on your car. If I push down harder on the brake, the car is going to slow down. So if I increase parasympathetic tone, I'm pushing on the brake harder, the car is going to slow down faster. So heart rate slows down, kind of the rest and digest relaxation part of your nervous system. The other side is a sympathetic or stress response. That's like putting on the gas pedal of your car. If I push down on the gas pedal of the car, I'm going to increase heart rate. I'm going to get a little bit more output, but it's going to put more stress on the system. So HRV is just a method using some fancy math and a bunch of other mumbo jumbo stuff in order to tell us what level of stress at that point in time is on your nervous system. And that's really cool because we can then do all sorts of stuff with that. I usually will measure HRV first thing in the morning because that's going to be your most stable time period to measure it. And once you have that, you can do it daily. And the nice part is having an app or ring or watch or whatever method you're using that's valid. You want to have a good baseline for 2 to 4 weeks and then kind of go back and look to see what's kind of moving that baseline, because everybody's individual HRV is going to be a little bit different. There's some rough gauges in terms of low versus high, but the big thing is looking at it and seeing what are changes in HRV. The pro and the con is that almost anything can be perceived as a stressor by your body, which could potentially change your HRV. You went out to the bar last night, you had like 2 drinks, your HRV may change. Paradoxically, the type of alcohol you have may have a different effect. You got in an argument with your spouse, your girlfriend, whatever, that can affect it. You beat yourself up in the gym, that could affect it. You get exposed to something, your immune system takes a hit, that could change it also. Dehydration, any stressor can change it. So it's good that those things will show up in your HRV, because if they didn't show up, then the measurement's worthless. It's not really picking up anything anyway, so who cares? The tricky part is then figuring out, is this really a legitimate change from baseline? And then what is the thing that may be the main driver? And then you can look at what intervention do you want to test out.
Yeah, so true. And I'd love to actually get into some of those hacks,
Sure.
like some of the things that we actually, like in terms of supplements that we can take, or in terms of actual things that we can do in order to have a better HRV score. Because I do know with some people that I coach, when we look at HRV, because we're using it in terms of trying to optimize our body, optimize our lives, is like, cool. So if you have a decent HRV score, then like you've got obviously got a good balance between both the go and rest state, as you were mentioning. And what I find is that a lot of people kind of just go, oh, I don't want to look at the score, because if I look at it, then I have to face that I have all of these things that I actually have to change in my life. Just these small little things that I either take for granted or I is like a guilty pleasure or something, in order to live my best life and like live at a level that I really want to be. And it's not until you look at it until you're like, oh god. So yeah, I'd love to hear your opinion on what do you think is like the best way to sort of hack it.
Yeah, so it really depends upon where you're at. So if I have a new client, let's say, and we've got a good accurate HRV, we've ran their baseline, I'll typically do the baseline for 2 to 4 weeks. I have an Oura Ring. I primarily use the iFleet app, because in athletes or people with a low heart rate, you probably need to be seated or even potentially standing to get a little bit more, not necessarily accurate HRV, but more representative. If you have an Oura Ring and you've got someone whose resting heart rate is down in the 40s at night, you may not see HRV change all that much. And that's because when they're sleeping, they're laying down, they have a very high amount of a parasympathetic or vagal tone. And other stressors may not just show up in that. It'd be like kind of hanging out on the beach and having these huge monster waves just kind of washing everything else, right? You see other things going on, but the huge waves are just kind of making it all disappear. So because of that high resting vagal tone, you may not necessarily see a lot of changes in more trained athletes. The fancy term is parasympathetic saturation. So in those people especially, I'll have them do a measurement commanded, usually seated or standing first thing in the morning. And that way you have the heart and the cardiovascular system has to work against gravity a little bit. So everybody knows that if you took your heart rate and you took it laying down, seated and standing, laying down is going to be the lowest, then seated, then standing. So, but that stressor from being seated, your heart working against gravity a little bit, you're in the same position every day. So over time, that difference sort of washes out. You're also doing a variability analysis. So once you have an accurate HRV assessment, and maybe you've got an athlete, so you're doing it in a seated position, you can then look at what they reported for self indicators. So I'll go through there. Like an athlete, you can self-report, how was my sleep? How was my nutrition? These different things, you just adjust a little slider score. And on the spreadsheet, it'll tell me that. So for each day, I'll see resting heart rate, their HRV score, and then the context, their self-report indicators. So I'll map it out and I'll look, what is their baseline? Is it go up or does it go down? So if I see a point, let's say 2 weeks in, where their HRV is like, holy crap, this dude's like super stressed, I'm going to look at the context and see what changed there. Oh, wow, Bob's reporting that his sleep went to shit for like 4 days. And then to your point, I used to have all these long, drawn out arguments with clients about, hey, you need to get to bed earlier. And sleep was like the worst argument because at the end of the day, you're basically having a value conversation with someone because they're not going to change their job. And at the time, they still had to drive to work. They're still spending time with their family, their kids, going to the gym. And they're like, oh, okay. So you're telling me the 1 or 2 hours I chill out with my spouse and watch Netflix at night. You're telling me not to do that and just go to bed. Like, well, yeah, I kind of, yeah. Like, screw you. That's a horrible idea. I'm not doing it. Right. And so it was just a very hard conversation. And I get it, right? You're asking a very big change of their lifestyle. But then I would send them a graph. I'd be like, hey, here's your stress. Here's your self-report of sleep. And I would just literally write in the email, what do you think is going on? And like these same people I had arguments about sleep would be like, oh my gosh, like, so you're telling me like when I don't sleep as much, I get really stressed. I'm like, yeah. And they're like, oh, this is so crazy. I never knew this, So just the getting them bought in via self-awareness is like number one. And then they're like, oh, what should I do about this? And I tried to refrain from saying, you remember those like 6 conversations we had about sleep and how you told me it was like the stupidest idea ever, but now they're kind of bought in and you're like, okay, so let's, do something about it. So I look at their score and I look at their context indicators. At a high macro level, if we're looking at things, let's say Bob has just generally a low HRV and, he's doing okay. His sleep's okay. There's no huge red flags that really jump out at you. Like everything's kind of, pretty decent. The first thing I'm going to look at is probably his V02 Max, right? So what is his aerobic capacity? Because if his aerobic capacity is dog shit, it's definitely going to affect his HRV. So I'll do a 12-minute Cooper run test. So take 12 minutes, take your GPS, run as far as you can in exactly 12 minutes. You can punch it in online. It'll give you about what your V02 Max is. You can also do a Concept 2 rower, do a 2K, so 2,000 meters. Go as hard as you possibly can for 2,000 meters. Punch that in online, and that'll give you a score of what your V02 Max is. If they're in, like, say, the bottom 30% of just general population, okay, yeah, I know, like, something's up. If they're 50%, yeah, probably something going on. If they're up near the top or really high, may not necessarily be a factor at that point. So that kind of gives you, is there something going on? Is there not? If there is, again, then you automatically have usually buy-in. Hey, Bob, did you know your VO2 max like sucks and you're like at the bottom 20%? I don't tell them that, but I just send them the score. I'd be like, hey, we did the VO2 max test. Here's your score, and here's how you rank relative to the population. And, most people I work with, similar to you, are relatively competitive. So like, oh my God, 22%. I didn't realize I sucked that bad. Like, what do I do to get better? Oh, great. I'm so glad you asked. Here's your new, aerobic training we're going to do a couple days a week. So those things are good for buy-in and also looking at the tests, and then you can retest them later. Hey, your VO2 max now is up to like 50% of the population. Oh, look, your HRV went up a couple points on average. Oh, cool. That is one of the things that's, moving the dial in that case.
Oh, definitely. And it makes so much sense, especially with HRV. It's like if you do want to be optimized and you do want to live better and you do want to have a greater body and longevity, it's like, well, you need to be fit. That's one of the first things, like train really hard. And we're blessed to have this technology that we can track it. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's to me, it's crazy, because again, like I said, I grew up where it was just an expensive thing in the lab. And so to be able to do it daily is great. So VO2 max is a big one. That's probably like a big hammer I use a lot. There's some dietary stuff. A big thing that I don't think enough people talk about, and something that I probably haven't talked enough about, is if you have someone and they believe they're at, say, maintenance calories and their HRV is constantly very stressed, everything else looks good, their VO2 max is good, they may be under eating. And they may be in more of a caloric deficit than what you think. So I always like tracking daily body weights to get an idea, is their body weight going up, down, or neutral? And if I see over time that their body weight's kind of trending down, that's great if that's what their goal was. If it wasn't necessarily their goal, they maybe were trying to gain weight or trying to stay neutral, that's telling me they're probably in a big caloric deficit. And that in and of itself is a stressor on the body. If you look at people who do, physique shows, I've done HRV and a fair amount of physique competitors now. The whole goal with them is just try to keep HRV as constant as you can. It's going to drop, and just make sure it doesn't completely shit the bed like until a couple of weeks before their show. Because we know that, with all the stressors being in such low calories, it's going to be a massive stressor. So it's going to show up in HRV. So something as simple as just, hey, are you in a caloric surplus? Are you in maintenance? Are you in a deficit? That potentially in people can affect their stress levels. And that's one of those things that's almost too basic that I'm guilty of almost overlooking that. Because in a couple of people, I'd be like, man, they're eating like 3,000 calories a day. I'm going by their self-reported movement. Like that should be good enough for maintenance. They're exercising, but they're not a CrossFit athlete doing it 2-a-days or anything crazy. And a couple of those people, I was like, why are they still going negative? We bumped them up to 3,600 calories a day. Boom, their HRV, shot up, and all of a sudden their performance was even better. So even at that point, their performance wasn't necessarily tanking. It was just they were so used to being there, and I was used to seeing that was their level of performance that I kind of thought everything was good. And we didn't notice a difference till we increased their calories. They actually still were almost weight neutral at that point. And then their HRV was better, and their training was even better than that. So, yeah.
Yeah, crazy. And I think it's super important to know, because there's a lot of people out there that probably haven't tracked everything. They haven't tracked their HRV, haven't tracked their calories, haven't tracked any of these exercise things. And I say for anyone who's listening who hasn't tracked anything, is to just track it at least once or twice. It can be like quite addictive, especially when you start like noticing that you can literally influence your biology by doing all these things. It's absolutely crazy.
Yeah.
What do you think? Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say a couple more things on the nutrition side. In terms of supplements, I haven't seen a lot that's moved the needle that much, to be honest. I'd be interested in what you found. Fish oil at higher doses can definitely do it. There's some literature showing you can get, 2, 3, maybe 4 beats per minute lower heart rate by just bumping up fish oil. Dose there, 2, 3, maybe 4 grams a day for 4, 8, 12 weeks. Some people appear to be more of a hyper responder to that than other people. I'm not really sure why. I use an at-home blood spot test, so we do mark their red blood cell content, VPA and DHA of fish oil, so we can track that too. So that's definitely one. If they're deficient in anything, obviously that's going to be a stressor, but barring any weird deficiencies, frank deficiencies, I don't see that much. Adaptogens sometimes, like for myself, I've noticed like reishi mushroom seems to help a little bit when I'm traveling. Keeps it a little bit more constant. That's been about it so far. I'm testing another supplement that I don't have any disclosures with. That's from a company called Timeline. So they have one that supposedly seems to help, but I just started testing it, so I don't have enough data on that. So supplement wise, I haven't seen huge differences. Obviously, like we mentioned, any stressors, if they're in a chronic sleep debt, that can make a difference. Caffeine may or may not. I've noticed, and we've published some new data on this, like I talked about. HRV changes with caffeine, if you're young and healthy and pretty robust, doesn't appear to be that much of a change. The huge caveat with that is most people who are using a high amount of caffeine also have a severe sleep deficit. So is it the caffeine or is it their sleep deficit? If I were to hedge my bets, it's probably more on a sleep deficit at this point. And then after you get beyond that, you get into the land of like really woo-woo weird shit. Red light, like photobiomodulation, appears to help a little bit. I've noticed more significant, just consistent HRV with that, and when a couple clients. Things that can definitely drop it would be if you've had any trauma in the past, if you have any weird eye issues. Like I have an eye issue where I don't see in 3D. So that is a constant sympathetic stressor to my brain. So my HRV is on iThlete. It's okay. It's like in the mid 70s. On Aura, it's anywhere from 30 to 50. But my resting heart rate on Aura is, 38 to 40, 42 on average. It's pretty low, and that's a relatively lower HRV for how low my resting heart rate is. So I need to do a fair amount of cardio stuff just to try to keep my parasympathetic tone high to counteract that. Last two things, if you have any weird scars, sometimes those can be weird stressors. Midline scars. So on people ask, do you have a midline scar? Do you have a C-section scar? And if they just don't seem to be responding to stuff, I use what's called a dolphin microcurrent. So we'll take that and treat it like a scar. We'll basically zap the whole scar. And sometimes their HRV, like the first time I did that, I've got a midline scar from an open heart surgery I had when I was 4.5. My HRV went up like 15 points overnight and stayed up for like 3 or 4 days.
Wow.
Which is pretty wild. And then the last thing is changes in breathing mechanics. So if you can get much better breathing patterns, that'll make quite a big difference in your HRV. So again, I do a lot of hands-on stuff, be activated training, and some RPR, reflexive performance reset, to get better breathing patterns.
What are they?
And in most people, that'll jump their HRV up pretty substantially too.
Yeah. What are they? What are those things?
The drills?
Yep.
They're very odd things that you wouldn't think of, right? So most breathing stuff is looking at more of just the mechanics. So this is saying from a neurologic response, how can we do things where you can work on yourself and get better diaphragm activation? So working on the sternum, for example, and underneath the ribs is activation points for better diaphragm. Working on the back of the head, like right where your skull comes into your spine, oddly enough, is for your glute max. And you're like, well, wait a minute. So you're telling me like I rub on the back of my head in that area, and that's supposed to help activation with my glute max? I'm like, yeah. Like, how that doesn't make any sense at all whatsoever. That one's a reflex from neurodevelopment. So when kids are learning to walk and crawl, the first thing that they'll do is they'll pick their head up at the same time as they get hip extended. So there's a neurologic reflex from getting your head to look up, firing those little muscles in the back of the neck at the same time you go into hip extension. Main hip extensor is your glute max. And it turns out those are two ways, meaning working on the head back here will get better glute max activation. And if you can get better glute max and psoas activation, the psoas, the other end of the psoas, after being the lumbar spine in the front and the back, the fibers literally disappear and become your diaphragm. Like they literally just become part of it. So if your psoas is all funky, your breathing is also going to be screwed up. So better diaphragm, glute max, and psoas makes a massive difference in function and breathing, and then consequently less stress. So HRV is better.
That is insane. And what like exercises do you do to do this? That is just blow my brain because I've read a lot of like breathing books. That's wild.
It's pretty crazy. So the first time I heard of this was, 7 years ago now. My buddy, Coach Cal Dietz, who works at the University of Minnesota, I've known forever. He comes to me when I was working down in the lab there because our lab was next to where he was training his athletes. He comes in and he goes, hey, man, I got this guy. He's coming in from South Africa. Crazy shit, man. Crazy shit. Like, you got to come to this certification. And I'm like, what? Like, what are you talking about? And he's like, no, I'm doing this certification in June. It's like the first time it's ever been done in the U.S. It's like $1,500. It's like, you got to come to this thing, man. And I'm like, okay, fine, whatever.
Done.
Great. If it was anybody else to be like, screw you, keep your $1,500. I'm not going to your crazy cert. So we're at Paleo FX at the presenter dinner. I'm sitting next to Cal, and this is like 2 months before the cert. And I'm like, hey, man, I said, who's this guy? Like, what's this $1,500 I'm paying for this cert coming up? He's like, oh, man, stand up, stand up. I'm like, okay. So we stand up, and he takes his thumb and puts it in between like your ribs on the side and the top part of your hip, that little side fleshy area, like the side noogie of death. And I'm like, oh, God, this hurts. So here's Cal, about 280-pound dude, like doing this at the side of me. And I'm like screaming, standing up. Everyone stops eating and like looks. And here's this guy with his arm around, like poking this other guy in the side who's like screaming. And we sit down and he's like, crazy shit, man, crazy shit. I'm like, you didn't tell me anything about what this thing is or like what the hell is like going on. All I know is this hurts now and I'm going to pay you like $1,500. And so I go to the cert, and it's looking at these different reflex points that you can poke on to get different muscle activation. So the psoas point is the middle of the abdominal. So you find your belly button, slide over right about the border of the rectus femoris in the middle. And the reason that's an area, again, this is happens to be a neural reflex. So when kids are crawling, their stomach is rubbing on the ground. And when their stomach is rubbing on the ground, that's a trigger to get hip flexion. And so you'll notice when they crawl, they get on their hands first, but they're still kind of dragging their stomach. And as they drag their stomach, you'll see them start to get more hip flexion. So it turns out that point is a psoas activation point. So there's different points that are mapped throughout the body. And then you can then just do, old school Kendall manual muscle test and then see, is it better or is it worse? And the nice part is with B-activated training, it's taught as a medical hands-on model. RPR, reflexive performance reset, is taught in a way that your athletes can then do those points on themselves. So you as a coach can say, hey, check out this point. Let's do a test. And then let's have you work on that area yourself. Great. Let's retest you. Oh, wow. Look, that's a lot better. And they're like, what? That's so weird. And so when they come in, they can do these different points on themselves to have better neural activation for muscular movement.
Insane. And then obviously when that's happening, I'm assuming that if your heart rate variability is up, that's a good indicator that that's working really well.
Yeah. So, I've measured a bunch of stuff. I've been trying to measure like FE1, FEV6, and vital capacity before and after. I've only done that on 2 people so far. They both got better. Can't really run stats or anything, but it looks like it, at least moved the needle in that area. Resting heart rate usually goes down. HRV goes up. Sleep usually gets better, right? So think about people who are high stress who can't downregulate, right? So if you go back to stressed out Sally, who's like, hey, I've been doing all the wonderful things you said. I've been wearing, I call them mole glasses, right? Your little orange glasses at night. I'm getting sunlight in the morning. I'm going to bed early, but I'm just like, super anxious and I can't turn my brain off. And, my resting heart rate's a little bit high. They just can't downregulate. They can't get into that parasympathetic tone. And a lot of times, if you look at their breathing patterns, granted it's anecdotal, you'll see, thicker traps. Their neck is real tight. They're kind of more upper chest kind of breathing. Their diaphragm just doesn't work as well. So if you get a better breathing pattern in them, you get more expansion into the upper lobes of the lungs. You get expansion sideways and backwards, right? It's called posterior mediastinal expansion, just breathing more behind your spine, so to speak. Then they're like, oh, wow, that feels so much better. And like, I'll do this on them on the table, and you'll see their stress level just drop as their breathing patterns change. So the first person I did this to years ago is my sister, who is a nurse anesthetist. Very high stress job. You're actually, putting people as close to death as possible and then getting them to wake up again for medical procedures. We did this. We got her breathing a lot better. I'm like, yeah, just go home, go to bed. You don't have to work tomorrow. Don't set your alarm. Just sleep in. She's like, oh man, I never sleep past, like 7.5 hours. I just wake up. I'm like, just whatever. Just go sleep. She texted me the next morning. She's like, oh my God, I slept like 10.5 hours. She's like, I don't even remember the last time I did that. Right? Because now she can downregulate. She can change her breathing. She can become more parasympathetic, which again is going to allow your body to enhance sleep. You get deeper sleep, better sleep, all that kind of stuff.
So pretty crazy. What could you do yourself? Like if I was just like tonight, I'm like, I want to do that. What can I do myself to work on to get it?
So the main things to start with is just take your finger with your thumb like this and put your thumb so it's just over the end of your fingers like that. Right, so it's braced. Yep, just over the end like that. And then I would do sternum. So right on your sternum, you're going to press relatively hard in like a circular type motion. And it's not going to feel good. It's going to feel pretty icky. Oh, yeah. Like that area is super, super stuck in a lot of people. So I would do the sternum. And if you want to get really crazy, go actually on the insertion of the ribs, right where they come into the sternum. So like on the sternum again, just right where the rib inserts into the sternum because that's a joint.
Yeah, mine is cracked.
And then at the bottom of the ribs on the bottom as they come out, you're going to come up at like a 45 degree. So you're going to try to get a little bit under it and that's going to feel quite tender and nasty. And then middle psoas, so belly button over to the middle of the, almost like right to the side of the rectus abdominis. Again, you don't want to use as much pressure there, but just work on that area. And then behind the head, so if you find where your skull in the back comes into your spine, that whole area right around the back and even a little bit around the side, like almost right behind your ear, work on those areas. Those would be the main ones, or what we call like a zone 1 intervention.
I'm gonna do like a magnesium bath tonight and work on all of those points
Yeah.
while I'm in there to see what happens, because it was very interesting talking about all of this is as weight's gone up, as you mentioned, my heart rate variability is going up at the moment, and I think why it's going up is because I walk all the time. I'm hitting like
Nice.
20,000 steps a day, and my heart rate variability just goes up. Like I remember for last year, there was like a 4-month period where my heart rate variability was just not going to get above 60. And I was like, what? It's been higher before. For the past like 4 months, I'm averaging at like 120 to 110. I'm
Nice.
like,
That's a huge difference.
there's a huge difference, and that's at an average. And I've had a couple of them like hit like 180. Like I'm like,
Oh,
what
wow.
is going on? 190. I was like, well, that's a new standard that I'm going to try and make. And it's sort of, it went down for a little bit, and it's gone up again. And I think a lot of it's all like diet and stress influence. But what you mentioned was waking up straight away. So for the past couple of days, my weight's slowly gone up. Is I've been waking up before my alarm. Like I've just gone
Cool.
and waking up. So that's like a really good point that I was just taking, like to put everything that we were talking to together, is maybe doing like a little bit of this work and doing some breathing, and maybe I'll have like a big meditation session today to actually focus on my breath. Will hopefully put me back on track and help me lose a lot of weight. And I'll probably eat some carbs or some B vitamins in there as well. So
Yeah.
that was I was just trying to then like summarize everything that we were saying and just putting it personally into me. So if anyone was listening, they're like, oh, okay, this is a practical application on someone, you could look at that, and I'd like challenge people who are listening to reflect that on themselves.
Yeah. So I do like RPR stuff, especially breathing stuff, even a little bit before meditation, like you mentioned. Sometimes before bed, if I have a harder time relaxing or better breathing patterns. And then related to HRV, one thing to watch out for too is always still pay attention to how you feel. Because I made a huge mistake like 6 years ago. I was like really into HRV. I was doing every day. I had all my clients doing this, getting all this data. And all of a sudden I started looking and I'm like, hey, wow, I was training for just a novice strongman meet, but it was winter, training in my garage. I didn't have access to implements. I couldn't get outside. It was all snow. So I said, okay, I can't do medley stuff in my garage. So I'm just going to do 225 on a trap bar, and I'm going to do reps of 20 to 25 for sets of like 3 to 5 sets, which is just freaking horrible. So I started doing that, did on top of my normal training. And I looked the next day and I'm like, holy crap, my HRV went up like 10 points. I was like, this is crazy. I didn't expect that at all. I'm like, it's just a fluke. So do it again next week. Same thing. It's like, whoa, that's weird. So I started adding it in another day. I'm like, I wonder if it's just something I'm doing that day. So I added it in another day. HRV goes up like 8 points the next day. I was like, wow, this is kind of crazy. So idiot me goes, maybe this is some sort of weird recovery work that I've, stumbled upon. And so I started adding it in, like, I was doing it 3 times a week at that point. And 3 weeks into this, I'm like, man, I feel like dog shit. I feel horrible. I'm like, what the hell is going on? And so then I looked at my average HRV, and my average HRV was just tanking like crazy. I'm like, well, wait a minute. How did this happen? Like I was looking at this, intervention. I would look the next day and it would go up, but I didn't look any further than the next day. So with the pattern that happened was the next day it would go up 8 to 10 points and then drop 12 points the next day. And like all the time, every single time. And so I've replicated this in other people too. So like really kind of heavy, dense interval work, like 30 to 60 second stuff, like the stuff that's just really hideous. It seems to bump HRV temporarily and then it'll just bottom out. And I was like, oh, I'm an idiot. Because I was so hyper focused on this number the next day that I didn't pay enough attention to how I was feeling. I kept feeling worse the whole time, but I kept convincing myself that it was good. So you can see like biphasic responses like that. And you can sometimes see phases that you'll go and you'll stay very parasympathetic. So in actually every physique competitor I've worked with, they'll be sympathetic, 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 higher, higher, higher. And then literally like usually a couple of weeks out from their day of their show, they'll just all of a sudden go wham, like super parasympathetic. And they'll just stay there. Their HRV will be super high. And at first I'm like, I don't get this. This doesn't make sense. Like their stress is very high. But then when you look at it, their resting heart rate is very low. You're like, hey, how do you feel? Like, I feel like death. I'm like, oh, okay, weird. And then you realize that you can be too high parasympathetic. So they didn't just go a little high. They were like 12, 15, 20 points above normal. And you would ask them like, hey, you know, like high intensity stuff, like, can you get your heart rate near a max level? They're like, nope, not at all. And so you'll go from this like stress, stress, stress. Your body's like going, you know, I can handle it. We're cutting performance a little bit. You don't feel good, don't feel good. Oh, wow, this guy's a dumbass. He's going to keep doing this. We're literally going to like pull the plug on him so that he doesn't hurt and injure himself. And you'll go
Whoa.
super parasympathetic and you'll feel even worse. You'll feel just like super tired. And again, with physique competitors, we know the reason that happened, and over time they do recover, and it does, you know, flip back over. But that was like one of the first times I was like, oh, okay, that makes sense. But it's crazy to see that in every one of them, that transition was literally like a day or two. It would go from like super sympathetic to like massively parasympathetic, like almost quote unquote overnight, which is kind of wild
Whoa.
to see.
That is absolutely insane. I'm having so many clicks to you saying that. I was like, oh my gosh, can't wait to go over afterwards and just have a look at all my different things. So, what would you say to someone, let's say, who's at that position in their life where they're like, all right, I really want to start optimizing myself. I want to get a better body. I want to get way better energy. I want to get better focus. I want to start like taking life like the bull by the horns and just run with it. What are some of the suggestions, encouragements that you would tell people like to do and invest in?
But obviously, you can invest in, you know, a coach or someone like yourself that can guide them through the process. That's going to be by far the fastest way. Because, you know, similar to you, like a lot of stuff I do at first is, okay, so that person comes in and I'm like, okay, man, my job is to figure out what are the biggest leverage points that are going to get you the biggest bang for your buck, right? Because most people who I see are probably majoring in the minor things. And it's sometimes harder to step back to make sure, okay, you got the basics under wraps. Cool. All right. Well, what is the next big thing? Maybe V02 Max, maybe fish oil, whatever. So just if you're not working with a coach, if you can try as hard as you can to take an objective look at your life and, okay, what are the goals you actually want to do? How do you measure those goals, right? So a lot of people say, hey, I want more energy. Great. How would you measure that? Like, how do you know when you hit that? You know, maybe it's you don't hit the snooze button 8 times before you get out of bed in the morning, or you can do some performance metric, or it's a cognitive test, or it's just self-report. Like, I just feel better, right? But have some way of actually monitoring and measuring it. And you don't have to do that with all things, right? So I tell people, like, make a list of priorities and try to focus on things that'll make everything else easier. So, for example, right, let's say you've got a goal of I want more energy, I want to lift heavier weights, and I want to increase my cardiovascular performance. If your energy level is really, really bad, that may impact the other two. So it may be better to focus on that first, and then just the other two kind of come along for the ride. So if you can find like the thing that drives the other components, have that be the primary goal, work on that for a set period of time, and then kind of move on to the next one. The hardest thing is to figure out what are the top things to work on, because if you try to work on 17 different things all at once, it's going to be a disaster. There is kind of a time and a place to do what I call the kitchen sink protocol, where, you know, you may throw a whole bunch of things at it just because you feel so crappy that you just want to feel better. The downside is you won't know what actually affected it. And that's fine if that's your goal, is just to feel better. So when I finished my PhD, I was working part-time. I started running my own business. I was a complete, absolutely freaking walking disaster for like 2 years after. Just a disaster. So I didn't care what I did. So I hired a good buddy of mine, did a bunch of blood work, did a bunch of stuff. I'm like, dude, I don't care if you have me do 20 different things and I have no idea what moves the needle. I just feel so shitty that I just need to feel better. I don't care if we figure out what it actually was. If you want to know more what it was, then you have to kind of do things slower, but one thing at a time. So again, that goes back to their personality too. So I'll kind of ask them that and say, yeah, we can do a couple more things, but you won't know what is the main driver of it, but you'll probably maybe get there a little faster. The downside is it's a little bit more time intensive. We won't really know what's moving the needle. We can move a little bit slower and we can do things kind of in incremental fashion. You'll have a better idea of what's actually moving the needle, but it's going to be a little slower process too. So some of that depends on their personality. But the biggest thing is trying to really whittle down what you're trying to do and get really clear on what are the outcomes you want to achieve and how do you actually measure that so you know if you're making progress and you know once you actually got there.
Yeah, and what do you think are some of the most like important tools besides measuring your HRV? Because obviously, like I would say that's probably one of the highest.
Yeah.
So what do you think else would be good for measuring?
So online stuff, I don't use a lot of technology, which is probably shocking to people. The main ones I do use is HRV. So I like that, obviously. I do use Aura with some people for sleep metrics, but it's not a requirement. A lot of times I'm trying to use data to make people more anti-fragile, not to give them another thing to just lose their shit over. So if they're constantly freaking out over the data and then having a bad day because Aura said they didn't sleep well, then we have to have a discussion about using that technology. The other part I'm really big on is measuring, like, what did you actually do, right? If we're working on protein, how much protein did you actually eat? If we're working on micronutrition, how much micronutrition did you eat? And then it sounds like just really basic and so simple, but when you went to the gym, like, what did you do? Did you lift more weight? Did you move more volume? Like most, I don't know, maybe it's not there that way here, but at most commercial gyms here, I don't see anybody write anything down at all. I see like one dude at the gym write anything down ever. And I highly doubt all the other kids poking around on their phone are like logging their training. So it's like, are you really going to tell me that 3 weeks ago you knew on set 2 of your bench press you did 135 pounds for 3 reps or 4 reps? There's no way you could tell me that. And I don't think your brain is designed to keep those things anyway. So just get like I'm a big fan of like, old school notebooks. Just write shit down, right? Just write down what you did. And over time, look, are you making progress or not? If you did cardiovascular training, it's super easy to measure now. Like all watches, Garmin, Apple Watch, whatever, have GPS in them. It's super easy to determine, are you making progress long-term or not? So it's fascinating to me how many emails I get from people that are like, hey, check out my HRV. Is this good or bad? It's like, well, I don't know if it's good or bad. I'm like, what did you do for training? Have you made progress in your training? I think so. I'm like, oh, you're not sure? Like, do you write anything down? Well, no. I'm like, well, I did this heinous rower session the other day. I'm like, the rower will tell you your average watts. Like, what were your average watts for your 20-minute row? Well, I don't know. It was just really hard, man. It was really hard. I'm like, okay, so you're putting in effort. That's great. But like, what is the outcome of it? Because you can definitely put in effort and get worse. And if you're doing that, you're 100% on the wrong track and you're going to burn yourself out. And it's going to suck because you put in all this effort and you got worse. It seems so obvious, it's like, yeah. So I'm a big thing of measuring, what was the output that you actually did? And not every day is going to be great. You have good days, you have bad days. But overall, if we look at the trend and we retest you, are you making progress on the things you wanted to make progress?
My God, I love that so much, especially in terms of actually tracking stuff. That's one thing that I fell off for training for the past couple of years. And it's like, well, my strength and size haven't really gone anywhere. So after this prep, I've been like consciously that, yeah, I'm going to track every little thing that I do in the gym, because as you mentioned, that's also going to reflect on my energy. It's going to reflect on my HRV. It's going to reflect on my ability to get as much work done as possible. It's going to affect my ability to focus. It's going to affect my sleep, like everything. And I guess that as much data as possible that you can get, which is obviously comfortable for you to track, because sometimes if you're looking, as you mentioned, too much, it's like, what's the most important? I'm like, well, I do track all this other stuff, and I have been for a while, but I haven't tracked that just yet. So maybe I should start tracking this. So that was me just like picking out a point, like, oh, I'm going to start tracking this. So if anyone's listening in terms of your life and your goals at the moment, like as Dr. Mike was saying, is like, what is the most important thing for you to track? Because if you figure that out, you can figure a lot of other things out too, which is like fantastic. So
and you don't have to track everything.
Yeah.
Right? You just have to track the things that you want to improve on and the things that you believe drive you to that. And if you're one of those people where you're like, hey man, I'm making great progress, I don't track anything, cool, then that's
Keep
fine. Like, I'm not worried about you. But that's not most people. And I'm a big fan of doing recreation. I do a lot of kiteboarding, and I've been trying to ride a skateboard and other stuff. Like, I have some goals I do track for kiteboarding, but other than that, I don't really track it per se for recreation. Like if my wife and I go play tennis, I'm not a good tennis player, I don't track anything for it. I write in my notebook, played tennis, because it's not my main goal. It's recreation. It's fun. It's something else to do. Now, if you said, okay, you're a professional tennis player, there's probably some things you want to track because that's your main goal now. So you don't have to track everything. It's just the things that you want to improve. You should, think about what are things you should look at.
Yeah, which is so important. And I love that. So I'd like to say thank you so much for coming onto the show, and for anyone who's listening, where can they find you, and also where can they learn the stuff that you've done? Because I know you've got a couple of courses out as well, which teach everything in detail. So would love for everyone to know.
Yeah. The main place is through the main cert we have is the Flex Diet Cert, which is a mashup of metabolic flexibility and flexible dieting. They kind of take you through 8 interventions from everything from protein to sleep to fasting to NEAT. And then you can find that at flexdiet.com, FLEXDIET.com. Go up there onto the wait list. That'll let you know the next time it opens. That'll also put you on the daily free email list, which is free. And send out a bunch of cool stuff, or at least what I think is cool stuff, to the newsletter list there. So go to flexdiet.com, FLEXDIET.com is the best place. Most of the content I have goes out over the newsletter. And then I have been doing a little bit more stuff with this weird thing they call Instagram. So you can go there at just Dr. Mike T. Nelson, which is a DrMikeTNelson. And I've got some content there.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing all of your knowledge and your wisdom. I'm sure everyone appreciated it as much as I did.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. And thank you very much for all the questions. I really appreciate it.
All good.